So let's pick up where we left off and talk more about IO psychology. Specifically now I want to talk a little bit about the history of industrial organizational psychology. I personally think the history of any field is fairly important, that we really want to be looking at how the history impacts the current use of the field. So my focus on history here isn't just a dry, let's talk about the past of the IO psychology. I really want to focus on the history as far as informing us on how IO psychology is today and why it is the way that it is based on this past. So we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of IO psychology. The past, we're going to look at important dates and events in IO psychology with, again, mainly an eye to talk about how these events are still resonating today in how the field is actually conducted in the science practitioner model. And then we're going to switch gears and talk about the future challenges to IO psychology in the next set of lectures for this particular day. So brief history of IO psychology. The first thing that really is necessary to be thinking about when we talk about IO psychology is actually just the history of psychology itself. So psychology broadly was created in the United States and Germany somewhat concurrently. So generally speaking, Wilhelm Wundt from Germany is given credit with the very first psychology lab, the very first program of research in psychology, and creating the field. However, approximately at the same time, William James in the United States was also starting a field of study of human behavior, the science of human behavior. So it's important to note that the two main countries where psychology is going to be seen growing over the next 100 years is going to be actively becoming a part of those countries' culture, those countries' practices, and those countries' academics is Germany and the United States. So we're going to talk about 1876 to 1930, and that covers basically the birth of psychology through World War I and up until basically the start of World War II. So again, with Wilhelm Wundt, we have the start of psychology, and Wundt's interest in psychology was fairly applied. He was wanting to ask questions about human behavior that involved applying human behavior to everyday problems. And this kind of thrust of what he was interested in is actually the reason that a lot of IO psychology comes down the pipe, if you will, from Wilhelm Wundt. And what I mean by that is that the way PhDs work is that to get a PhD, you have to find someone else that has a PhD. You study under them, you do a dissertation, and then you are granted your PhD. When you get a PhD, there's a hooding ceremony where your mentor with a PhD basically officially confers upon you the same title. If you look at most functioning and most academic PhDs in IO psychology, the vast majority of us actually can draw our lineage back, myself included, to Wilhelm Wundt. In other words, Wilhelm Wundt hooded a new PhD, that person hooded students, those students hooded students, those students hooded students, all the way up to me, Joel Nadler. I'm 11 PhD hoodings separated over those 100 years from Wilhelm Wundt. So we're going to talk a little bit about these additional names in IO psychology. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. I strongly encourage you to take a look at your book about their contributions. But the first one we're going to talk about is Hugo Munsterberg and James McKeen Cattell. So Munsterberg gets credit for writing the first book of really applying psychology to the workplace. And James McKeen Cattell is very much influential in that he's one of the first people to strongly advocate for the use of psychology in organizational decision-making, mainly governmental decision-making, but was somewhat successful. And now, again, this is mainly coming out of Germany. At the same time, Walter Dill Scott and Walter Van Dyke Benham are also starting to apply the measurement of personality traits and individual differences to making organizational decisions. Now, World War I comes along, and World War I is fairly significant because this is the first time where governments are truly seeing the need for IO psychology. And what's driving this is that suddenly the two countries that psychology is strongest in are mustering giant armies. Germany is creating an army in 1914 at the start of World War I. And also, as America decides to get involved in 1917 through 1918, they also are going suddenly to this massive creation of an army. In the past, there was, of course, training for the military, but there wasn't a lot of need. There was basically only 2 or 3 types of troops that you needed to train, and the training for them was very similar. World War I is the advent also of the first truly technological war. Now, suddenly, not only are you needing to identify in a mass creation of an army who's going to be good leaders, you need to identify who's going to be good at doing the calculations for artillery fire. In other words, mathematics. You need to figure out who has a strong aptitude to become a good pilot for the Air Force. You need to figure out who can be a decent engineer for combat engineering, explosives, and also for who can be good in tank crews. So there was suddenly a need for both governments to be able to quickly and cheaply categorize or classify people to jobs. And that's one of the major points of IO psychology, the idea of measuring people, measuring jobs, PE fit, but also that classification, figuring out who will be the good leaders, who will be the good engineers, who will be the good statisticians, etc. Both countries did turn to psychology during this time, and we have the first creation of mass selection tests. So the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, or cognitive ability test, became in the United States both the Army Alpha and the Army Beta test, mass tests meant to measure aptitude to try to figure out who's going to be a good leader, who's going to be a good tank driver, who's going to be a good pilot. At about this time also, during World War I, we have the first PhD ever granted specifically in industrial psychology. Now, at the time, IO psychology doesn't exist as a word. There's basically applied psychology, which is a broad term meaning that you're taking psychology and trying to apply it. And actually, at this time, an applied psychologist could just as well be working with the Army doing selection, working kind of in organizations to make them better, or could also be working individually with people as a clinical psychologist. Applied just meant that you weren't doing research, you were using the skills to help people, either as groups and organizations or individuals. And that first PhD in I psychology, industrial psychology, was given to Lillian Gilbreth, and her research was actually on research in time and motion studies, so she was actually closer to a human factor psychologist. But from 1917 on is when we can first start talking about IO psychology, at least at this point, industrial psychology, just I psychology, as a unique field. So off to the side, while this is occurring, why we have psychology being focused on in how could it be applied to the workplace, World War I actually basically bringing psychologists into the selection process, and the first program starting to call something industrial psychology. We have something else going on at the same time in business schools, and that is the application of these kind of similar scientific methodologies to business settings. So we have a couple of ideas here. Broadly speaking at this time is what we now refer to as classical organizational theory. Classical, obviously, like many times, has been added later. It was originally just called organizational theory. It's now called classical organizational theory. And the idea behind classical organizational theory was that there should be one way to make organizations very, very productive. And when you think about this, this had an amazing appeal because this is effectively the Industrial Revolution. The idea of moving from a model where you have highly skilled workers doing a single task over a long period that requires a large amount of training to more of a construction line or assembly line kind of a format. So the idea is that if you actually, before organizational theory, classic organizational theory, if you actually wanted to build a car, you would need someone that knew how to build a car from the ground up. So this is someone that would require an enormous amount of training. They would need to know how to make brake systems, how to make engines, steering equipment, all of this. But training that one person up to that level takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and also it takes that person a long time to build a product. Maybe a better example is, let's go with barrel making. So if you want to take barrel making prior to classic organizational theory, it would be an apprentice model. You would apprentice to a barrel maker. You would learn everything there is to know about making barrels, which includes choosing the wood, cutting the wood, shaping the wood, treating the wood, also creating the iron bands, bending them into shape, building the barrel, making sure, testing it. And that whole process might take 5 years of apprenticeship till you actually had all those skills, and then you could make barrels. And again, from start to finish, it might take that person a day or two to make one barrel. Now, instead of doing that, what classic organizational theory says, don't train one person to do all of that. Train individuals just a couple weeks each to do one single task. One person to cut the wood, one person that knows how to sand the wood, one person that knows how to treat the wood, one person that knows how to fit the wood together, one person that knows how to make the iron band. Put them all in a line, provide them the raw materials, and instead of now having one person that might take 5 years to train, you've got 5 people or maybe 10 people that each took a month to train. So now getting a whole group of people up to that skill level is taking 1 month, not 5 years. And now instead of one person making one barrel, you have 10 people that could make 50 barrels in a day. So as far as productivity in the workplace, the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the idea of classical organizational theory, and specifically what's referred to as scientific management, management guided by scientific evaluation of the workplace with a goal of what do you change in the workplace to increase productivity, to increase profit. That created enormous gains for organizations. So if a business professional with this kind of training in organizational theory and scientific management came into an organization and restructured the organization, that organization might go from making $100 a week to making $10,000 a week. So at the time, this is what was going on in organizations. So there really wasn't a lot of room for IO psychology to get involved in organizations because what they were offering, we can make it a little bit better. We can help you select employees. Really at the time, organizations are going, why should we do any of that when if we use this method, we're going to get this giant increase in productivity and profitability. That's why during this period, IO psychology is mainly finding its fit in the military and in governments needing to do mass selection. Okay, so Frederick Taylor is one of the big names in the idea of scientific management. He worked with various industries and to improve productivity through simplifying the tasks, training workers on one task so they perform at an optimal level, and also creating what he considered to be the perfect form of management, which is a very hierarchical system. In other words, you have a president or CEO at the top, vice presidents under them, associate vice presidents, senior management, lower management, and each level becomes larger and larger, and that entire hierarchical structure is about managing all of these unskilled workers that are doing very simplified tasks at the very bottom of the organization. And there's a strong assumption in scientific management, and that is Theory X. Theory X is the theory that employees don't want to work. They aren't motivated, and they shouldn't be motivated. That basically the best way to get things done and to make profitability, according to scientific management and classic organizational theory, is you want to make the jobs as simple as possible and then have a large amount of management over those people doing those simple tasks to make them work. And as I said, this worked. It created incredible increases in productivity, but a downside is it treated people as machines. And we're going to see that as we move forward out of this, that kind of opened the door for IO psychologists, specifically the creation of the O side, to come in. Theory Y is in counter to Theory X, and Theory Y comes both from management theory eventually, but also from IO psychology. And that's the idea, again, that people matter and that an organization, once they shift to this new way of doing things, the only way to make them better at that point is to start thinking of people as human again. So briefly, before we move on to the history of IO psychology, I just want to kind of talk about open systems model. So the idea of open system model also comes out of this kind of management viewpoint, and it's a way of looking at organizations. And the idea is that IO psychology can be involved in every part of an open system. So all organizations are much like living creatures. They have inputs, things that they need to bring in to the organization in order to survive. So we have to eat, drink, and breathe. Organizations pretty much are the same. They need to consume. They need to consume resources. They need to consume employees. They need to consume information. Once they have those inputs, they do throughputs. Throughputs are what the organization actually does. So how does the organization use people to turn inputs or raw materials or raw information into a marketable output. The outputs are what the organization actually creates, both intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. Now, all of this is occurring within an environment, the local community, the political environment the organization exists in, the legal environment the organization lives in, and also the economy that the organization lives in. And finally, the feedback loop, that once the outputs are created, those outputs become dependent on feeding back to the inputs. So if an organization makes a product that does not sell, the feedback could be that they no longer have the resources to gather more input. And if this cycle is ever interrupted, usually an organization will fail. So industrial organizational psychology is going to focus on all of these. Industrial organization, especially I-side, is going to look at inputs. How do you get the right people and the right materials into an organization? It's going to focus on throughputs. How do you increase motivation and productivity and groups and leadership in an organization? It's going to focus on outputs. How do you measure outputs? How do you measure performance in a way that gives you information? It's going to look at the feedback loop. So once that information is out there, how can you better inform further inputs? And finally, it's also going to look at the environment, asking how does the environmental changes change what you need to do in an organization? So let's get back to that IO psychology. So where we're at now is World War I has ended. There is clearly been, from the United States government and the German government, an interest in having psychologists help at least in selection in military settings. Now, at the end of World War I, the militaries all shrink back down, and suddenly psychologists somewhat find themselves out of a job. There's not as much drive for psychology to help making decisions and selection. And again, we're coming kind of to the end of all of the organizations doing this kind of scientific management and classic organizational theory coming from the business side. At about this time, before World War II actually starts, we also have the Hawthorne studies, which really focuses at human relations. And this starts kind of a human relations movement. And what they found in the Hawthorne studies was they had basically gone in to organizations that had already followed the tenets or the suggestions of classic organizational theory or scientific management. So they had reorganized the way they were supposed to. They were hierarchical organizations. They had people doing very simplistic tasks with lots of management to make sure they did those tasks. But the problem was once they had done all that, then their profitability kind of stabilized. And organizations were saying, well, is there anything else you can do? So the Hawthorne studies were about going into an organization and trying various ways scientifically to research, doing studies to see if changes would cause increases in productivity. So they'd change the lighting. They'd make it brighter. They'd find productivity would increase. Oh, so they'd reduce the lighting to see, and they expected, well, if we increase the lighting, we get more productivity. If we decrease it, we should get less productivity. Actually, they found the opposite. When they reduced the lighting, again, more productivity. If they offered different types of breaks, each time they did a change, productivity increased a little bit. And that's when they realized what they were doing was that the people were doing very monotonous tasks. Any change to their environment was a welcome change to that person that had a very boring job. That's what was causing the increase. So this basically blows open the doors to the O side of IO psychology. Theories of how to motivate workers. Basically, this is where theory Y comes in. So theory X basically suggested that people are unmotivated, they're not trustable, and they have to be forced to work. Theory Y says, make a person happy and they'll want to work. And that's where this comes in. So the emotional world of workers, the studies of job satisfaction, the ideas of organizational commitment, all come in through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This is often referred to as the human relations movement, and it's also the strong creation of the O. So all the pieces are in place by the end of approximately the 1950s and 60s. There is clearly the concept of kind of the industrial side and the organizational side of psychology. The two big events that really get IO psychology rolling as a field is World War II once again calls on IO psychologists and human factor psychologists to basically do the job of selection again. But this time, they're being called in to help select for the military again, to refine selection techniques, to refine the measurement of performance in the military. But as the military is done with them, they're now coming back out of that military service or working for the armies into a business environment that is no longer the same as in World War I. When the psychologists were finished working with the governments at the end of World War I, organizations really didn't have any need for them because they were already seeing this big payoff from scientific management and classic organizational theory. Now, these IO psychologists that have honed their skills on selection, PE fit in the military and working for the military are now coming out and finding organizations going, well, what can you do to get us to make even more money? The final main event from this period of time is the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VII, which basically made it illegal for organizations to discriminate against protected classes. And this particular law also made IO psychologists almost a requirement in organizations, because organizations suddenly needed to be able to make a legal argument that their selection, their performance appraisal, and their promotion systems were free of any type of bias. And the people that had those skills were the IO psychologists, who knew how to measure individual differences, knew how to measure jobs, and knew how to actually create systems to pick the best people regardless of what category of people they were for those jobs. So just reminding you, so as we're coming out of the 1960s, we now see a shift in organizational theory from this kind of theory X to theory Y. And again, the theory X approach, or traditional approach, distrusts employees, assumes employees are lazy, assumes people are not interested in work, and only believes people are going to work when they're pushed or managed to work. Theory Y, by contrast, suggests that basically the orientation of people is that we should accept them, we should promote the betterment of human resources, and that if you treat people well, that they will be trustable. That the need to achieve and to be responsible is a strong human drive, and that people want to actually be at work. They're not lazy, they're willing to work if they're given the chance. That most people are highly interested in their jobs, and finally, they work well when trained and recognized. So it really is a shift that's going on in organizational thinking. And when you shift to theory Y, you're also basically opening a big door for psychology to come in and say, we know how to measure all of this, and we know how to achieve all of this. We know how to motivate people. We know how to get people interested. We know how to make something. We know what people find interesting, and we can help redesign jobs to be better. So just briefly, the important dates of IO psychology. Again, 1988, Kertel measures individual differences for the first time, also develops the first mental test, and starts to really push the idea of using these tests in selection in governments. Munstenberg arrives at Harvard from Germany, and also the American Psychological Association is found, and Munstenberg publishes the first text in IO psychology in English. In World War I, we have Scott Brigham enlist in the Army and develop group intelligence test, and also Lillian Gilbreth awarded the first IO PhD. Mayo, who did the Hawthorne studies, arrives in the United States in 1923, and in 1930 publishes his first studies that basically start the creation of this idea of human relations, oocyte psychology, theory Y. In 1932, we see the first modern I-O textbook published that's actually focused on both the I and the O. In World War II, human factors are applied to solve aircraft accidents, and also, again, we see I-O psychologists or psychologists in general working within selection. In 1945, I-O psychology becomes the Division 14 of the American Psychological Association and is acknowledged as a unique field of psychology. In 1950, we see a large explosion of commercial tests for selection purposes, as the tests that were being used in the Army are being adapted now for civilian use. And in 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act, which really drives almost the need for IO psychology in organizations. And in 1982, that Division 14 of the American Psychological Association officially becomes becomes named PSYOP, and a strong focus of a professional organization to basically protect and define the field is created. So the challenges to IO psychology in the 21st century, basically IO psychology continuously needs to be relevant, useful, and grounded in scientific methodology. So what distinguishes IO psychology from other business professionals is that bottom one, the reliance on a careful and systematic scientific methodology to the application to workplace problems. IO psychology constantly needs to make sure that it's relevant, so that top part, in other words, keeping on track of current trends. So right now, globalization, and also adapting businesses to a changing and maybe not so healthy environment is major relevant concern. So IO psychology needs to adapt to remain relevant. And always, IO psychology is an applied subdiscipline. So putting theories and research into action, in other words, making sure that IO psychology is always making an argument that it is useful to organizations. So current issues in the workplace, just briefly, is employment discrimination still occurring? So a lot of IO psychology and research is focused on continuing to try to eliminate bias in selection and promotions. And there is evidence that there is still discrimination. We have certainly come a long way in this country and in other countries into reducing gender bias, reducing racial bias, reducing bias based on religion, but there are still issues. How serious is stress in the workplace? So the concept of measuring stress, creating workplaces that are less stressful, and managing stress in the workplace are very current issues. Today's workplace, are they feeling safe? So there's a lot of news stories about workplace violence, and IO psychology has been focused on how to create general feelings of safety and to protect people while they're at work. How can jobless people be brought into the workforce? So that's another current issue in the workplace, is how we actually take people that have been long-term unemployed, retrain them, and get them back involved in the workplace. To what extent should the work and non-work lives be kept separate? So a lot of current research in IO psychology is also about issues such as work-family balance. More and more workers coming into the workforce are expecting to be able to have both an active work life and an active family or non-work life. We're also seeing a large increase in the number of women in the workplace, and women and men, husbands and wives with children, and also dual earning income families. And finally, what is the relationship with foreign companies? So looking at cross-cultural work, how people from different cultures work in other cultures. We also are very focused on the changing nature of work. So the changing nature of technology, the fact that many organizations now are doing a lot of work virtually with virtual work and virtual teams. The idea of boundaryless careers and workplaces. So the old model was that you found an organization, you took an entry-level job, and your career would likely be with that same organization. We're seeing less and less of that. We're seeing more and more the more modern model is often your career will be moving from location to location. I'm a relatively new professor, and I have already worked at 3 different universities in different tasks. That is not the model of 10, 15, even 20 years ago. Generally speaking, you finished your PhD, you took a job at a university, and that was it. You were there for life. Today, it's a different environment. You're often expected to take a postdoc, which basically is a postdoctoral degree. It's not a full-time job. It's not a long-term job. It's a 1 or 2 placement where you continue to get experiences before trying to move to another location to hopefully get a more permanent career at a university. So the use of teams and the use of virtual teams, organizations are really looking at employee monitoring and employee security, examining also less employment security. So as employees are more willing to shift from organization to organization as a part of their career, that means also organizations are also offering less security as far as promising employees that they will have a long-term career. Diversity in organizations, globalization, and also the movement away from that, again, that scientific management, that classic theory X, is the idea that organizations should be very hierarchical with many, many levels. A lot of organizations are moving away from that, especially recently, to more flat organizations. Much less management, much more self-management. And that's another area of the changing nature of work that IO psychology is focusing on. And finally, as far as the new workplace, there's a lot of focus in IO psychology on the differences, generational differences, on how younger workers today are looking at work and looking at careers compared to how it may have been looked in the past. So if the nature of work has changed, probably also the nature of the expectations of individuals has changed. So younger adults, research has found, So there has been some research that's found that younger adults want jobs that provide an opportunity to use current skills and develop new skills. So that sounds pretty standard, like everyone would want that, but that seems to be a stronger thrust now that basically younger workers coming into the workplace are really looking at jobs as a place to develop new skills. They're wanting not just to learn, just to do a job. They want to be able to grow and develop. And that is a newer expectation. And I don't think it's necessarily that younger adults today are different than younger adults 50 years ago. It's that the expectations of what a job should provide them has changed. Some research has suggested that younger workers become cynical and disinterested easily. This is definitely a perception that exists. I'm not sure how close it is a reality, and in fact, a lot of research is still being done on trying to determine, is this an actual cultural difference in younger workers, or is this a perception of younger workers that may or may not be accurate? Younger workers do tend to be more highly educated than their parents, and this has been true for quite a few generations. Each generation tends to be more knowledgeable, more technologically savvy, and more educated than their parents were at the same age. So more technological sophistication, and also more globally aware and more connected with greater open-mindedness. So we're going to be moving on next to kind of looking at where IO psychology is going into the future, and I look forward to talking to you in the next lecture set.